a German magazine called Zenith magazine, which is a special interest magazine on Middle Eastern affairs here in Germany, and I am the director of a think and do tank called the Candid Foundation here in Berlin, which is focusing on the Middle East and the Mediterranean. And together with my partner, Dr. Nassif Naim, who's sitting over there, I'm also working as a consultant and advisor on state and law in the Middle East for a consultancy that we founded and that Dr. Nassif directs with me, which is called Zenith Council, which is an offspring of Zenith magazine. So we venture in all things Middle East. And of course, extremist thought, extremist ideology, and countering extremist ideology has been one of our major concerns since we started with our activities. And with our magazine Zenith, I've just opened the website. Maybe you can get some more information about it. We are constantly working on this subject, but not by trying to produce counter narratives, but by trying to produce our own narratives. I think there is a very important, the term of counter-narratives, I think you've heard this many times before, is an attempt to counter the narratives of extremist organizations, be they religious or be they political, be they Islamist extremists, jihadists, right-wing nationalists, supremacists. The attempt to counter a narrative is always referring to the narrative of the other side, which means I hear an argument from someone, and I try to debunk this argument. But I think, and I will probably explain when I'm discussing about the symmetries of extremist thought in Europe and in the world today, I would like to explain to you why I think countering narratives, producing narratives, referring to the narrative of the other side, to the narrative that you want to get rid of, is not really the solution for me. I think it is important to create our own true standalone narratives about our societies, about culture, about politics, about whatever subject, and not always try to refer to the other narrative that we consider wrong, extremist, and dangerous. Because by doing so, we are, of course, always, we are building it up. We're building it up. We are letting it become a fact. And this is, I think, a step that we need to go beyond. First of all, I would like to, because it's a very, very recent experience of mine, I would like to ask all of you to participate. Imagine that you are the editor-in-chief of a magazine, or let's say the desk editor, and you have to write a headline. If you had to explain Hamas, to contextualize Hamas to a readership, and you think they don't know what it is, how would you qualify it? What would you write? 3 words. The organization Hamas, which is ruling Gaza. It's a Palestinian organization, of course. Could you tell me, volunteers, could you tell me how you would qualify it? You don't get any credits or notes for the answer. So please play the game with me. Unless it's not fun to ask like these people because they know, of course, like very well. Ambassador, please volunteer.
The terrorist organization.
The
terrorist organization. Hamas.
Terrorist organization. Okay.
Depending on the editorial line.
Let's say the European Parliament discussing. Tomorrow the European Parliament will discuss its policies vis-a-vis the organization Hamas. Terrorist. Any other suggestions?
I see it as also unfaithful organization.
Unfaithful organization.
Even to Palestinians themselves.
Okay. Please.
I would say radicalized organization.
Radicalized or radical? Radicalized, okay. Any other?
Well, when you're asking this, I assume, but you did it now because everything was moved forward. But it depends on the editorial line.
Well,
Because it depends on
yes,
the
we are not actually now. We are not in the newsroom now. I'm just like I'm trying just like to get some inspiration. So I understand the question can be discussed, but we don't have the time to discuss my question. So, any other suggestions?
An organization with extreme elements
with extreme elements. Okay. Well, you know, news organizations have to come up with a description very fast, you know, and very, very short. They have to say, okay, I want the reader to understand what this is about, what this organization is about. So I choose the most common and the most basic denominator to characterize it. Hamas was just an example. So if you read the German news media, you would find the description radikal islamisch, radical Islamic. That doesn't make sense, because Islamic is not a political ideology. Radical Islamic, the radical defines, at least that would be the case in German and in English for sure, the radical would define the degree of intensity of Islamic. So radical Islamic would mean that this organization is very Islamic, very radically Islamic. And we all agree that Islam is a religion with a wide spectrum of interpretations. It is not a political ideology, though there are political ideologies that are inspired by religious thought. But there is no such thing as radical Islamic, let alone the fact that organizations like Hamas are theologically not very radical. They are politically radical, they pursue a political ideology, but they're not theologically radical. So by using the wrong words, I'm trying to, this is making me nervous, the screensaver. By applying the wrong words and by applying whatever words, we create narratives and we create facts. Okay? One of my first teachers was a BBC veteran who said, never use too many words to describe something, to describe an event, and make sure you do not apply any unnecessary judgment. And he gave me an example with regard to the word terrorist. If a, and I don't want to, let's say, let me give an example. Somebody throws a hand grenade into a restaurant in Paris at lunchtime on a Sunday. The news will be what? A young man threw a hand grenade into a restaurant. Would I need to say a terrorist threw a hand grenade into a restaurant? Well, that's exactly the point. The information that somebody who throws a hand grenade into a restaurant is a terrorist, or let's say the conclusion, the interpretation, is for all of us to make, right? It can contextualize, but actually is not even necessary, because a person that throws a hand grenade into a restaurant is obviously a terrorist for whatever motivation. Now, when you look at several incidents that happen in Europe, that happen here in Germany even, very often the reflex of the media is, when they see something happen, they say, I hope it's not a terrorist attack. In my neighborhood, 200 meters away from my home, 2 weeks ago, on Friday, an SUV, I think most of you have read this in the German newspaper, an SUV ran into a crowd in the sidewalk and killed 4 people. 2 young men, my neighbor's mother and my neighbor's child. The baby was 3 years old and was instantly dead. The driver of this car claims, according to his lawyer, to have had an epileptic crisis attack, and therefore just ran into the sidewalk. I'm not going to judge the evidence, the facts, because I don't know them, but the reaction of people, also in the social media, was this a terrorist attack? This was a dreadful accident. But what if a person willfully, with intention, drives into a crowd for whatever reason? What is the difference between a terrorist attack and a terrorist attack? What is the motivation behind it? What kind of ideology, what kind of driver is behind this attack? That is a question that we ask ourselves, and by this question we qualify the danger. And this is, of course, very controversial, because is it worse? Is it more more scary, more brutal, more consequential if the person that drives a car into a crowd is actually a right-wing nationalist, a jihadist nationalist, some crazy guy who wants to create havoc? To what extent does it concern us, and to what extent is it important for us to include this in our judgment? That is a question that is relevant for the media, because we tend to qualify the exotic motivation, or let's say the exotic perpetrator, as something more dangerous than when it's coming out of our own camp. And I think this is a dreadful mistake, and I think the media in Germany are learning step by step to understand the symmetry of terror and of violence and extremism against the civilian population. I want to discuss, or want to talk very briefly about the symmetries that I see between religious extremism, qualified as Islamist extremism, or qualified as jihadist extremism, and right-wing extremism in Europe today. And I think it is also a very important method, and it's a very important element of presenting alternative, independent, standalone narratives, not counter-narratives, but narratives, if we, first of all, try to understand and try to contextualize something with our own cultural background, which says, I see something happening in the Middle East, or I see something happening as a direct result of a confrontation or interaction between somebody from a cultural background and my own cultural background. I see this. And before I judge it, I try to contextualize it with my own experience and with my own cultural background. What difference would it have made if the identity of the person that has perpetrated it, or the identity of the suspect, was not Middle Eastern, but was German, for that example? And I understand it becomes much easier to find a global approach that Jan has also suggested today, a global, cooperative and comprehensive approach, if we start to look into our own cultural biotope, into our own cultural environment, when we analyze such incidents or such situations. I'll give you an example. A few months ago, everybody knows what the AfD is, right? The Alternative für Deutschland.
Yes.
Everybody knows it. It's, I think, a right-wing, partly extremist party. It is, though, not banned by our authorities, of course. It's represented in the Bundestag, and it has a wide spectrum of ideologies. A few months ago, a person hit the news because he was a Syrian member of AfD. Yeah, you look surprised. Why are you surprised to have a Syrian in the AfD?
Yes, we
Well, it's a
know
bit
this.
fun, isn't it?
Yes.
Why is it fun? Why is it peculiar?
Well, part of it, like, you know, they invest so much time and so much energy in, like, you know, I wouldn't say discriminating, but, you know, it's the party of people that do not have like the good side on refugees and Syrians, and yet seeing so many incidents like in Sachsen, for example, where Syrian refugees have been mistreated or
Okay, so this was exactly the reaction of most of the media. They were like, how can a Syrian become a useful idiot for a right-wing extremist organization? Well, those of you who has been to Syria? Anyone?
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, okay, 5, 6. So you know that right-wing nationalist ideology is known to Syrians, because not all Syrians are globalist, internationalists, tolerant. Well, so racist thought, essentialist thought, is something very common in Syria. Right? So you have a multi-layered society with a lot of different groups and communities. You have something that can be qualified as sectarianism, which is not the main, but one very important element of conflict in Syria. constantly and being exploited by many sides. And the fact that somebody, in this case, the young man is hails from the Armenian Christian minority in Aleppo. He's notorious, his name is Kerkov Almasian, is a member, or let's say a disciple, of a right-wing, nationalist current in Syria, and he supports very much the ideas of AfD, which is, you by definition are what you are, and you cannot really change what you are. You can become a German, but as long as you are a Muslim, your loyalty will be with Islam. I'm parroting and kind of a bit cartooning the lingo of these people. And you can never become a full German. Your loyalty, your identity is always going to be with your community, with your religion, with your race. And we are pro-diversity, but we think diversity is managed best when we are diversely apart. That's a very, very dominant, or let's say a very mainstream attitude. My friend Nassif Naim, who is Christian and Syrian himself, knows exactly what I'm talking about. And there's absolutely nothing controversial. You have an organization in Syria which is active across the Levant, but in particular active in Syria and in Lebanon, which is called Al-Hizb Al-Suri Al-Qawmi Al-Ijtimai, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party. Not National Socialist, Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, on y soit qui mal y pense. This organization was founded by a very interesting, controversial intellectual by the name Anton Saade, who believed that there is something which is a Syrian nation, not a Syrian race, but a Syrian nation, and due to its very particular historical development and destiny, the Syrian nation is different and maybe superior also to others in the region, that Syria ranges from Mesopotamia, from Iraq, to southern Turkey, to Cilicia. Later on they included Cyprus, Palestine, and that this Syrian nation is a result, of course, of migration and a mix of certain cultural elements, but that this Syrian nation belongs together. And that everybody else, in particular the Jews in the region, are probably guests, but don't belong to the Syrian nation. That is a very, very, I'm just like summarizing this very quickly, a very conventional political thought, ideological thought in the 20th century. I mean, here in Germany, we know what this can lead to, but of course, the ideology of organizations like the SSNP is probably inspired by some of Mein Kampf's lingo and let's say rhetoric, but it's of course far away from what happened in Germany. The Germans are much more extreme and much more relentless in the implementation of their ideology, of course. So, but the fact that there is a community of destiny that belongs together and others don't belong to it. Others are not part of it. And others will never be part of it because due to their identity of religion or race or ethnicity, they will always stick to their community and can never be loyal or solidarian with the others. That is a very common thought in the Middle East. I don't talk about the racism towards people of color, people of darker color that you also have across the Arab world and across North Africa. That is something which you can find also in the language, of course. But racism is something as conventional in the region as it is and has been in Europe for a long time. So what do we do with this? We realize that it is not so exotic to have people from the region that one would probably qualify as religiously extremist, leaning towards, Muslim Brother ideology, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, whatever. And then you all of a sudden realize that people from this region can be as much nationalist as ordinary Europeans or Bio-Deutsche. as one can say. So, what do we do with this? We look at their ideologies and we look at the parallels that you see in Islamist thought and in the roots and in those that inspired Islamist thought, and you look at the nationalist, right-wing nationalist thought, and you see many parallels. First of all, the idea that there is a dominant group and there is minorities that might be welcome, but that should not open their mouth and claim their rights. They depend on the tolerance, on the benevolence of the majority. That is something that is a common streak. You find it in Islamist thought that says the religious minorities, they are welcome to live among us, the Christians, the Yazidis, the Jews, whatever other, the Alawites, the Shia now becomes a bit more complicated, but you have the minorities, and then the majority says the society is made for us. So the minorities are welcome to live here, but they should not claim their rights because they live on our mercy. I call this mentality Islam first, right? Because it's exactly the same thing. And I think the Muslim Brotherhood is an interesting example, also a diverse example of a political organization that has given offspring to many political parties and to many means of appearance. But the Islam first mentality that the state is foremost made for the majority and everybody else is just visiting, that is an ideology that I find common among the Muslim brothers, let alone the jihadist groups. If you look at the jihadist groups, Daesh did not kill all minorities. They went for certain minorities that they considered irredeemable. The Yazidis, the Alawites. No conversion is allowed. You cannot become a true Muslim if you are originating in these communities. That's the thought of jihadist ideology. But if you are a Christian, if you are belong to the Ahl al-Kitab or the Ahl al-Dhimma, then you are misled and you are certainly not going to paradise, but you can live under the mercy and the protection as long as you pay jizya and kharaj, tax, to be exempt from military service. So the degree on how we look at minorities among a wide spectrum of Islamists, Salafist, and even jihadist groups, it's not necessarily that the minorities have to disappear, that they need to be killed, but we put ourselves first, and minorities have privileges but no rights. This is exactly the same as we see among a variety of right-wing nationalist organizations and ideologies in Europe. Germans first. There are some politicians that claim people that don't have a German passport should not be entitled to social benefits. Okay, now you can argue you can have a German passport without being Bio-Deutsch, without being of German nation genetically, but these right-wing organizations, of course, want to set the bar much higher for you to become a German citizen, to become part of the society. Now, in the right-wing spectrum, there is a large, there's a lot of gray areas and a lot of graduation. There is people who say, okay, we have no problem with foreigners as long as they become German nationals, as long as they pay taxes, as long as they don't build mosques, and as long as they don't wear a headscarf in public. Right? I strongly disagree with this position, but this is considered a moderate right-wing nationalist. There's others who believe that, again, as I said before, diversity is nice, but diversity means that you live on the other side of the Mediterranean and I live here. There is the white supremacists and a large, let's say, variety of ideologies here. And there is, of course, the armed supremacist groups. And these groups are becoming more and more powerful, more and more dangerous, more and more heavily armed. And I agree with Dr. Jassim that they represent a fundamental danger to our society. They represent a fundamental danger to our security. And we need to tackle them, or we need to address this problem with much more resources than we can address Islamist or jihadist ideology in Europe, because the number of members and the number of potential, let's say, guerrilla fighters or even right-wing terrorists in Europe is much higher. They're much better connected. They're much better, let's say, integrated in their society. And they are also, and that also is a common streak between them and the jihadist groups at least, and parts of the Islamist spectrum, they believe that our state and our constitution is illegitimate, illegal. They not only they want to take over power, but they want to abolish the system. I want to say one word before I conclude and open the floor for questions. I want to say one word about the Muslim Brother organization. I'm not a legal expert to the extent that I can say this organization needs to be banned or not, because Nassif probably knows much better about the legal implications of what it means to blacklist, to ban an organization that does not exist as an organization in the country. Though it has, of course, many groups and associations that are affiliated with it. But it took me a long time. I've been working in this field as a Middle East expert for 20 years, and it took me a long time to understand what is the common streak between this organization and many of the nationalist organizations in Europe. It is the idea that in order to be able to implement, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, Islam, to be a pious Muslim and living your belief freely and correctly, you need to gain political power. It is absolutely compulsory. You cannot it's not an option. It's not an option on the long term to live in a society, in a state that is not Muslim and that doesn't have a Muslim ruler. Because according to Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s, to his thought and the ideology of the organization, it is imperative to have political power to be able to implement Islam. Many Muslims say, as long as the ruler is just, as long as the system is correct and it's a rule of law, I can live my religion freely and I don't need to live in an Islamic state or in a state ruled by a Muslim. You have Salafist organizations who say, even if the leader is the most corrupt, even if, as they say, his face his head is as big as a raisin, you are supposed to follow the rule and not to revolt against the authority as long as the ruler is Islamic. And I've conversed with many Salafis who said, I would like to live in Saudi Arabia. I think the system in Saudi Arabia is better than in Germany. Say, why do you think the system in Saudi Arabia is better than in Germany? Well, they say, because even though the ruler is corrupt and even though the system is not good, it's better to live in a Muslim country than to live in a non-Muslim country. Among the Muslim community of Europe, I wouldn't even say this is subject to debate. I think the majority of Muslims in Europe reject this notion. They say, we prefer, as long as the ruler is not corrupt and is just, and as long as we live in a rule of law, Islam is applied in a much better way than it is in corrupt Muslim countries. But the answer to these questions, of course, needs to come out of the Muslim community in Europe, and for that matter also out of the Muslim community in the Middle East. The right-wing extremist organizations consider our system an illegal system that needs to be toppled. No question about it. At least the extremist, nationalist, and supremacist organizations, the ones that are also militant. You have mentioned the Reichsbürger in one of your presentations. These are people, individuals that live in Germany that consider their home an extraterritorial entity. Some of them have guns at home. They prefer to go to jail than to pay taxes because they say our system is illegitimate. And there's a lot of conspiracy networks on the internet that explain to you why Germany is actually not a state, but a company that was founded by the American occupier, and I don't want to go into these details of these lunatics. But this is a movement. There's people here who believe that our state is not valid. There is parties like the NPD, the National Democratic Party, which is not democratic, of course, that challenges our constitution and says, if we come to power, we will abolish it, we will reverse the constitution, we will overthrow the system. Now, this party is not banned in Germany. Some of you might have followed the discussion. Why is an organization like the NPD, which is openly neo-Nazi, not banned? Because our constitutional court says, in order to be able to, a party is something almost sacred. Political participation is so important, and the freedom of political participation is so important that we cannot ban a party unless this party is able to overthrow our system and to abolish our constitution. And they argue a party that has a turnout of maybe 2%, a result of maybe 2% of the votes, 2 out of 100 citizens voted for this party, or 1 or 0.5, depending on the election. As long as the turnout is so small, there is no way that this party can gain power in the parliament and abolish our constitution. That's why it does not represent an imminent, it might represent a theoretical but not a practical threat to our constitution. Therefore, we cannot ban it. And again, they have been trying, there have been many ways in which the government went to court and they made the argument. They said, we still want to ban it. Then there were some issues that the German security agencies had their V-Leute, their kind of their undercover people in the party, and that these people were much more influential than they had thought. And the question was did the government somehow contribute to the success of this party and all these controversies? But the main argument is we cannot abolish, or we cannot ban such a party. Now, of course, when you look at the Muslim Brothers, the situation is a bit more difficult. Because, first of all, they're not a party, they're not a club, they're not a football club, they're not an association, they're not a cultural organization. Even the members of the Muslim Brotherhood would tell you that they're not members of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's one of the interesting characteristics, peculiar characteristics of the organization, that its members usually deny being part of it. Because the organization has been learning for 80 years how to act conspiratorially, how to build networks, and how to defend itself against the state, against various attempts to counter them, to arrest them, to undermine them, to infiltrate them. So they're really professionals. And after 80 years or 90 years in existence, it's hard to imagine that they would say, okay, we give up. Right? But the question is, does an organization that is nothing more than a network of people, basically, have the capacities to harm our democracy? Can it really overthrow our constitution? Can it really act against our constitution? And can it really implement change? It's a different discussion because it's not a party, but I think we have to nevertheless look at these phenomena from in a parallel approach. See, it doesn't matter if you are Muslim or if you are German or if you are Christian or if you are an atheist. Important is, how do we address these phenomena structurally, extremism, and can we find a comprehensive solution, joint solution together? I think if we want to look at these organizations, we should also not so much I'm a Middle East expert. I studied Islamwissenschaften, like Middle Eastern Muslim Islamic studies in Germany and in France. And very often we are asked, how do we address these issues? How do we deal with radicalized youth? How do we, what answers can we give them? How do we isolate them from these dangerous networks? And I say, frankly, I speak on the media about this quite a lot. I can give you some educated guesses about it, but I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a lawyer. So you should probably go for depending on the question you have. It's not because I have studied Islam that I know something about terrorism, because these two words appear together in the media and the phenomena may be sometimes interacting or overlapping, but an expert on Islam is no expert on terrorism, as he is no expert on nuclear physics or international trade or psychology. Okay? So really look at the specific qualification of the people that you ask for answers and for advice. The ones that can probably contribute to decrypting and understanding and breaking up these networks of organizations that are detrimental to our society and to our constitution, or to our state, for that matter, are probably people that know about cults. Because the Islamic State, the so-called Al-Qaeda, many of the organizations that Dr. Jasm has referred to, work like cults. Sekten, as we say in German. They try to disconnect you from any outside contacts. If you are a member of a cult, you have a leader, you have somebody to refer to, and that leader's foremost interest is to get you out of your social environment. Don't talk to your brothers and sisters anymore, to your cousins. Don't talk to the kuffar. Right? If you are a member of Milatu Ibrahim, or if you are a member of the Reichsbürger organization, first criteria is, though the Reichsbürger are less centralized, of course, in the organization, is disconnect from everyone who could influence your mind negatively. Scientology. Anyone remembers what that is? It sounds so 20th century, right? It sounds so old-fashioned. Scientology, after the downfall of the Warsaw Pact and after the wall came down, the Scientology was very successful in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in South America. After dictatorial regimes fell, societies were kind of in search for identities and for new solutions. You had the Scientology filling the gaps, filling the void. They were very successful financially. They were very successful in recruitment. The religion that they were selling to people was kind of weird. But we didn't go after them with armies and air forces and drones. But the Federal Internal Revenue Service, the Deutsches Finanzamt, many state organizations narrowed their marge de manœuvre, narrowed their freedom of operation. And eventually, psychologists on a local level, churches, an army of volunteers, of people that are cooperating, that were personally concerned with their families sometimes, went after them and eventually managed to defeat. I mean, Scientology is still there, but the totalitarian approach that they have attempted to undermine society, to undermine state institutions, in order to increase their power and their leverage, that didn't succeed. And this is just an example, I think, when we want to address these phenomena, be it militant groups or be it political conspiratorial organizations, we really cannot say this is about Islam, so let's get the Middle East or Islam experts in. And I'm saying this, though I am one and I'm often solicited, but I say, like, sorry guys, I cannot help you. But let's really try to approach this on a very sophisticated and expert level, and not say Islam and terrorism are mentioned so often together in the media that the Islam expert can help you with fighting terrorism and the other way around. Thank you very much. I think there are a few questions and remarks and criticisms.
Fast answer to your question. It's possible to ban such organizations like Muslim Brotherhood here in Germany, but at first you have to put this organization on the level of terror organization, like PKK in Turkey, like ES. That means this
we have only one
put them
speaker
on
for
the level of
immigration,
terror
maybe 10 minutes after
which
10
actually
minutes.
for the Muslim regarding the Muslim Brotherhood is something difficult
Mhm.
in general, because there are many opinions in this direction, and this organization has many faces, actually, not only one face. Answer to
Thank you. Please. I think everyone can say something about this. It's so much personal experience. So you don't need to be an expert in any field to have an opinion about it. Any questions or remarks, or maybe I'm making no sense at all?
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And what I truly liked is that you clearly distinguished between Islam and terrorism, the complete distinction between the two. And I really like that. I appreciate that. My question is, geopolitics has played a major role in creating extreme elements all over the world. And how we as civilians or the global citizens in today's time and age, how can we help combat the problem that has risen and that has been rising for centuries together from, now in post Second World War. How can this problem be combated as global citizens from us? Thank you.
Again, I have an educated opinion about it, but I'm certainly no expert in this field. Because it very much depends on your own social environment. But I think most of us, certainly those that have traveled to the Middle East, but also those that have lived outside of a big urban society like Berlin, maybe lived for some time in the countryside, in smaller towns in Eastern Germany, whatever. Everyone has been somehow connected to, or not, or has a personal experience with discrimination, with extremist thought. For some people, it's in the own family. And I think the important something that everyone can do, and I'm now sounding a bit like a politician, is not give up. Not hold your ground. Hold your ground when you have discussion. When somebody makes a racist or extremist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic remark. It's not just like. It's not that we don't accept the opinions of people. It's not that we want to imprison someone or just not silence them. But it's important to counter it. And it's also important to a certain extent to lead by example and to have your own narrative and have your own discourse and your own argument before the other side forces you to bring it up. At the same time, there's two schools of thought with regard to how to engage with extremist thought. First of all, we have to qualify it. A lot of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, but also across the world, are using the argument of extremism, of terrorism, for their own benefit. One example is Saudi Arabia. Atheism is, by definition, terrorism in the Saudi. Mind, it's written down. It's a definition, because when you're an atheist, you question the legitimacy of the state, because the whole state is built on a religious justification. So when you question when you question religion, this means that you don't recognize the Quran, that you don't recognize the whole Überbau, in a Marxist term, that the system is built on. So, by definition, you are an enemy of the state, you're an enemy of the Constitution, you put yourself outside of the Constitution. Right? And these are, as long as authoritarian systems in the world are using the terms terrorism and extremism for their own benefit, to discredit or political opposition, then we have a problem. So I think we should be very careful what kind of concept of terrorism and extremism we adopt on a good geopolitical level. However, trusting our instincts, I think one expert on jihadist movements once told me, extremism is like pornography. You know it when you see it. There's a lot of discussion about what it is. Well, we have qualified. We have developed quite some criteria, but also based on common sense and reason, quite an understanding of what extremist thought is about. And hold your ground. Hold your ground in discussions and don't let the other strike first. I think that is a very, very important point. Yeah, please.
Thank you. In my very uneducated term in communication, I would like to ask you a little bit about what you began talking about, counter a narrative versus creating your own narrative. That to me sounds a little bit like propaganda. Would you like to expand on that?
A counter-narrative is very much, I think, inspired by the concept of Contra propaganda. And I'm pronouncing it that way because Contra propaganda is, I think, something that the Soviet Empire was the master, and still practicing it with absolute, like.
Goebbels was also not bad.
I think Goebbels was great in propaganda.
Yeah, in propaganda.
Now, Contra propaganda is, of course, something different, which is like creating doubt, constantly spreading doubt. Okay? I spread something about what the US president or Angela Merkel or Macron might have done or might not have done. There is an incident and I spread doubt about what might have happened. So this means that I may immediately own the higher ground because it could have been this way or the other. And those that usually benefit from the absence of truthfulness are the ones that have that pursue, let's say, criminal projects that are trying to manipulate society. So the absolute truth, not letting any doubt exist, and the absolute doubt, the omnipresence of doubt, everything is a matter of interpretation. I think both are the enemies of truthfulness, and both are dividing society and are benefiting from dividing society. So my experience is like there was certainly a time in the 1990s when it was quite fashionable to say it's all a matter of interpretation. Well, the Russians are behind it, the Americans are behind it, some major interest, international finance, the Jews, the Freemasons, somebody must be benefiting from what's happening here. Well, that's what we are here for. We are here for to analyze the situation, to count the to make the numbers, to make the math, to count the evidence, to bring it together and say, this is what we can say about what has happened. This is what we cannot say about it. Okay? So there's people working in this field, handling information and trying to make sense of something. Countering propaganda or countering extremist narratives with facts is a good thing, and it's important. But unfortunately, it's not enough. It's not enough. Facts, in a world of people that do not accept facts, are a very weak weapon. And I totally understand the frustration. I think it was Jean Tigana, the former French football player, who once said, I'm using a vulgar term, but I'm quoting. He said, arguing with a racist is like playing chess with a pigeon. You can be as good as you want. You can go to checkmate. In the end, the pigeon is gonna kick all the pawns from the field. It's gonna shit on the chessboard and say, "I won." Okay? So what's the point? What's the point? And I understand the frustration of many. Many also say, engaging right-wing extremists in conversation, giving them access to our media, is a total waste of time because they're going to win. Because their followers are always they're always on the winning side because their followers are much more simple-minded. Well, extremism is nothing only for uneducated and poor people, by the way. There's a lot of educated and wealthy people that are very much engaged in extremism, and they cannot be reached by arguments. If you talk about like certain Islamist movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood and their many offsprings, they say we are the only ones who can contain jihadism. We are the only ones who can bring these people back. There is representatives of the Muslim community here, lobbyists that say only Islam can fight terrorism, or only Islam can fight jihadist extremism. Well, if you make that argument, then this means what? It means like there is an organic connection between the two because they are. So basically, you play into the hands of the other side, even though you don't want to do this. There is people who say only the conservative parties, and only if we are leaning to the right and we make sure there's nothing right to us, which means that we have to be nationalist and we have to be extremely right in our discourse. Only by this way we can contain the extremists because we're going to bring their audience back to their constituency back to us. I don't think that this works, to be honest. But I have no major insight in this. I don't have the higher ground, and I cannot tell you. I have doubts about it and reservations about it, and I understand the frustration. But I think everyone has to handle this and approach this in his own best, to his or her best knowledge, and try it. I can tell you, keep them out of, like, marginalize them, ostracize them, don't let them access our media networks. I can't tell you this because I'm not sure if this is the right answer. We are not there yet. We are not at the end of the experiment.
If I can add something to this about the dialogue process. 2 weeks ago I was at an event where during the cocktail phase, for us as a scientific assistant for MDB of the IFD, so a member of parliament for the IFD, was actually in attendance. And once people found out because of his pin, they fled. Like this guy was automatically nuclear. And he's black, by the way. He's from Syrian. He works for MP from Bremen, but he's black. But he's an AFD guy, and he grew up in East Germany. And everybody just ran away. And we went to him and we just started talking. And we weren't having this, well, you're crappy. No, it's just, well, what are our views on this? The dialogue, to try to take it out, to entschärfen, so to basically defuse the discussion, and not right away. And that a lot of people don't trust that aspect.
There's a term in German which is a pretty new term, but I find it very interesting. It's Kontaktschuld. Kontaktschuld means that you are guilty by association or guilty by interaction, which means if this was a convention of the AFD, I would be speaking here, I would be guilty because I court the AFD, I normalize the relationship with them, I give them a forum, I give them legitimacy by what I do. A few years ago, I was invited to a student organization, and actually the person that approached me was very high recommended, and I didn't really have time to focus on what it actually is. Said, like, can you come over to Salzburg? We're having our annual meeting there. It's a student association. I said, like, okay, the person that recommends is a nice person and I trust, and I didn't really pay much attention. A few days before, I was like planning my trip, and I looked up what is this organization, and I realized it's a Studentenverbindung, which is one of those, that's a German and Austrian thing, like kind of student fraternities that have a doubtful history because they were extremely nationalist. They were banned during the Nazi time, but they are like kind of, let's say, the breeding ground for right-wing intellectuals and networks. This was, I'd say, a rather right-wing, not extremist, but leaning organization from what I read. I was like, what do you do? Do you go? Or do you tell them, sorry guys, I didn't understand who you are, I prefer not to talk to you? I decided to go. I decided to go because I thought, if I have to talk to someone, then it's these people. I don't preach to the converted, I don't talk to my own people. I mean, I do, but it's boring. You know, I have a message to these people. They wanted me to talk about Syria. And they said something like, yeah, I hope Mr. Gerlach is going to give us a different story from what we read in the mainstream media. It's like, many of the people who are running the mainstream media are friends of mine. They are reporters, journalists on the ground. They have sacrificed a lot. Some of them have died. They are professionals. What they're telling you about Syria should be considered. Political judgment is one thing, but the information that you get is worthy and valuable. But they expected me probably to give them an alternative narrative. So what I did, I gave them a presentation about mass displacement in Syria. How the Syrian government is systematically bombing neighborhoods and destroying the livelihood of civilians in order to remove them from certain neighborhoods, whatever the goal is. It can be discussed. Is it to fight the armed groups on the ground? Is it because they want to change the demography of the country? And I gave them a presentation, a very, very, let's say, cold presentation about the strategy how to displace civilian population efficiently from neighborhoods in Syria. I didn't start discussing with them, you have to understand the humanitarian situation of these people. These people are, the situation is dreadful. You have to have empathy. You have to you have to understand their, no, not at all. I didn't play the empathy argument. I just gave them a presentation about how you do this, strategically and militarily. The people were shocked. They were shocked. They didn't come up with, yes, but these are all, the people that are all coming here, they're all Islamists, and they're all dangerous, and Daesh is coming, and all these refugees, they're of no use for our country, and so on. No. They were just shocked by the blatant neutrality in which I presented them these strategies that are being applied. And I don't know, maybe I haven't changed any political opinions, but I think I have made people think and understand about something, regardless of their political views. And maybe we need to think, what language do we use when we do, and what kind of information do we pass when we talk to certain audiences? But I don't think we should just not talk to them anymore. I wouldn't have done it though if they had recorded this and put it on YouTube and said Daniel Gerlach speaks at our convention. I wouldn't have done it. I'm speaking for too long, I think.
No problem. It's good.
It's interesting.
Also, my presentation is short. Then can I do it? Then we can read our recommendations. Thank you so much.
Yeah, please become a member of Zenith Club or become a subscriber. It's 79 euros, and you will increase your knowledge about the Middle East, and also